Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 275. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a special episode for y'all today. It is a talk I gave on May the 4th at Denver Liberty on the Rots. It's a great group. Twice a month, they meet at the Independence Institute in Denver. So they asked me to come out and speak, and this is the talk I gave with a Q&A on the end. It's a little bit longer than the normal episode, but my talk is about an hour, and then the Q&A is, I think, about 20 minutes. So, if you just want to listen to the talk, that's fine. I don't think you need to hear the Q&A, but I talked to a few people. They said that, it might be helpful. You did answer the questions well, so I kept that in there. But yeah, so I don't think I've ever done this before where I've reran a speech as an actual show. Let me know what you think, guys, and just want to give a huge thank you to Josh and his wife, Kira, who run Liberty on the Rots and who invited me out. And to mention, Liberty on the Rots, all just spelled out, .org is the URL for them, and then they have spontaneousorder.store where you could get merch for Denver Liberty on the Rots. So anyways, they've had so many great talks there. If you're in the Denver area, I highly recommend you check out Denver Liberty on the Rots in the future. I go even when I'm not talking, just because it's a cool group of guys and girls to hang out with. So check out Denver LOTR. Now, I guess, just everything I do is at the Libertarian Institute. I'm also at antiwar.com, and then YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for video versions. Twitter is con_interest for the show. I'm at Kyle Anzalone_, and then the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. Promo code PEACE, that saves you 20% and gets the show a kickback on great, high quality, lab tested CBD. All right, here's my talk. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to hear me talk about war for probably the next hour. I know it's now is the most fun topic, but this I think is very important, and it's really a part of our national conversation right now about what we're going to do in Ukraine. Really what I'm going to be focusing on is Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but the greater American proxy war that we've been waging against Russia for the past couple of decades. And so to start with the fall of the USSR in 1990, Ukraine becomes a nation. And if you go back, this is a map of Europe pre-World War I. You can see Ukraine back up here is well a part of the Russian Empire. Post-World War II, Ukraine right here, well a part of the Soviet Union, right? And so whenever Ukraine becomes its own independent state, there's going to be a lot of complications to that. And in fact, George H.W. Bush didn't want Ukraine to become its own independent state. This is from Ryan Minkin at the Mises Institute. Indeed, in the case of Ukraine, President George H.W. Bush even traveled to Kiev in 1990 to lecture the Ukrainians about the danger of seeking independence from Moscow and decrying the supposed nationalist threat. And so we could see, even going back to 1990, the U.S. has different opinions on what should happen with Ukraine and wants it to remain a part of Russia post-USSR. A couple very problematic things when you have the USS dissolve is that there's nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so imagine, the U.S. stops becoming, a unified country, and we have our nuclear production all over the place. And so there's plants out in New Mexico and Arizona. What happens to those nuclear weapons if, New Mexico is its own independent state now? Well, in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum in exchange for security assurances, which are different from security guarantees. It's just saying we should support Ukraine, but it doesn't actually mean we have to. And then in exchange also, Ukraine got to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another very important thing that happened when Ukraine became its own independent state, this area down here, the Crimean Peninsula, ended up staying with Kiev. Now, this is a territory that since the American Revolution has actually been a part of Russia. And during the Soviet Union, it was transferred to Ukraine, but at that point, Ukraine was just a state in the larger Soviet Union, of course, and so it really didn't matter all that much. Nobody was going to fight a war over it. So initially, the Crimeans wanted to become their own independent state. Well, that fell through, and then they remained with Kiev. But there's a major naval base on the Crimean Peninsula called Sevastopol, and this is Russia's main naval base on the Black Sea. And so Russia negotiated with Kiev in 1990 that in exchange for $526 million, Russia would be given access to that naval base until 2007, and then in 2010, or in 2017, and then 2010, that was expanded until 2042. And so that naval base being very key, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The U.S. policy towards Russia in the 1990s really sets the stage for what we're going to do. Ann Williamson is a great journalist who went to Russia in the 1990s and saw how the U.S. was arranging the Russian economy. We were given a lot of power in Russia to decide what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. What the American genius economists decided was the best solution was to take all the property of the Soviet Union, divide up and estimate the value, and then give all the citizens a voucher to buy some of the equipment that would go up for auction. Well, they did, of course, and initially they only put up low value items. And so the people who were poor were either forced to exchange their credits that they got for like food and things like that in major banks, and people who had access to Western funds were able to buy up the majority of the credits. And then later on, they end up putting everything on the open market, and people were able to buy up a lot of assets extremely cheaply. And this led to two major rounds of inflation in Russia in the 1990s, 80% inflation at one point. And actually, the standard of living declined so much in Russia that the average life expectancy for males dropped 5 years. And so, as a libertarian, this was about the most shocking thing I've ever learned. In Russia, after 1990, they got prices. They didn't have prices before. It was run by a communist state. Nobody owned anything. They got property rights and they got prices, but the way the Americans helped the Russian elite fix the economy ensured that the average people would continue to suffer in Ukraine. Now, Ann Williamson explains that the policy here was to keep Russia down. It was about harming the Russian economy and taking as much from Russia as they could. And what they anticipated would happen is that their handpicked elites would be so incompetent that within a few years, their businesses would fall apart and they would look to sell them off. And at that point, the Western interests could enter the Russian market and start to buy up these products. And so again, this caused a massive drop in the Russian standard of living. Now, another very important thing that happens is actually, this is the cover of Time magazine in 1997, but the story's from 1996 and it's titled Yanks to the Rescue. And it explains how American political officials and lobbyists went to Russia and helped Boris Yeltsin win re-election by essentially rigging the election. They did a whole bunch of favorable polling to make it look to the Russians as a foregone conclusion that Yeltsin was going to win. They also launched a smear campaign against Yeltsin's main opponent, who was of the Communist Party. And so this created a situation in Russia where on election night, after Yeltsin won, one of the American advisors to Yeltsin celebrated, saying that we made the Russians terrified of the Communist Party. Of course, after Yeltsin won election in 1996, he would go on to promote Vladimir Putin a couple of times and then essentially make him his successor and set up largely what we have today between the U.S.-Russian relationship. Yeltsin was often drunk, depressed, and sometimes sick. He was not a good leader whatsoever. Russia was extremely corrupt at the time, and yet he was able to remain in power for 4 more years because of the American policy. All right, so then we have, this is George H.W. Bush's promise to the Soviets, or the declining Soviet state and new Russian state. And he told Mikhail Gorbachev, the first Russian president, last Soviet premier, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if Germany was allowed to become reunited. And so Russia said okay to Germany becoming reunited and becoming a unified NATO member state. And in exchange, NATO wasn't supposed to expand, but it only took a couple of years, and Bill Clinton added Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So it takes NATO only 7 years to consume Warsaw, which of course the competing Warsaw Alliance was the Cold War. And even Boris Yeltsin, who just had Clinton's help getting elected, denounced this move as unnecessarily provocative. But George W. Bush really stepped over the line, adding Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia into NATO. Bush also put Ukraine and Georgia on the path to NATO membership. And if we look at a map here, we could see that the U.S. is well moved into the former USSR at this point, and Ukraine and Georgia, the two countries in pink here that are designated to one day become NATO member states, are within a few hundred miles of major Russian cities. Russia sees this as a clear red line. In fact, the current CIA director, but at the time he was working in the State Department, William Burns, said that Ukraine entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interest. Also at this time, we have George Kennan, who is the person who came up with the NATO containment policy during the Cold War, right? We got to fight in Vietnam and Korea to prevent the expansion of the USSR, predicting that NATO expansion would eventually upset Russia to the point that Russia would intervene in Ukraine and a civil war would break out, and then the Americans would cry Russian aggression. And so that's essentially exactly how it's ended up playing out. Now, Barack Obama went on to add Albania and Croatia to NATO, and Donald Trump added Montenegro and North Macedonia. Now, Joe Biden has kind of dropped the pledge for Ukraine to become a NATO member state with the Russian invasion, but at the same time, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is saying that one day Ukraine could join NATO again, and we also have Joe Biden strongly supporting adding Finland and Sweden into NATO. And if we look at the border, Finland, this wasn't even on the map when I had, that's a major long border with Russia. It's almost going to double the Russia-NATO border. So this guy, John Bolton, did some real damage to the U.S.-Russian relationship, and this is extremely important. There were 3 key agreements that John Bolton was fundamental in ripping up. The first is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and this was designed so nations wouldn't develop interceptors for their intercontinental ballistic missiles and would maintain the balance of nuclear power between Russia and the U.S. When the U.S. ripped this up, they started building missile defense systems, including the Aegis missile defense system and its onshore variant, the Aegis Ashore system. Now, this is very important, and I know this is a lot of detail, but these systems use the Mk-41 launchers. And yes, those can fire interceptor missiles to maybe shoot down a Russian ICBM, but they could also fire nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles, and the U.S. has moved those placements into Poland and Romania, giving Russia about a 5-minute time before those missiles could reach their capital city. So this is an extreme violation to Russia, and in fact, those missile launchers violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Russia responded by developing a missile that also violated the treaty, and in the Trump administration, rather than negotiating with Russia and the U.S. removing its Mk-41 launchers from Eastern Europe in exchange for Russia dismantling its system, the U.S. said only Russia was violating the treaty, and John Bolton led to the destruction of it. We also have the Open Skies Treaty. Now, this wasn't an arms control agreement. It just allowed the U.S., its NATO partners, and Russia carry out overflights in each other's countries. And so this ensured that people were following the other arms control agreements that we had together. We also had the New START Treaty, which was thankfully saved by our current president, Joe Biden. It looked like Trump was going to let that expire, but in February of 2021, Biden did extend that. And it's the only thing that puts any kind of cap on U.S. and Russian nuclear stockpiles. So as you see, the arms control situation has definitely devolved. Now we have the U.S. meddling, dividing Ukraine, and this is essentially how we end up in civil war in Ukraine from 2013 on. It initially starts with protests in late 2013. Now these protests, I think, mostly emerge organically. The Ukrainian government is extremely corrupt. There's a lot of poverty in a country that has a lot of wealth pouring into the state through just the fact that it has pipelines running through, and they get transaction fees that the natural gas passes through Ukraine, billions of dollars a year. A lot of that money ends up getting stolen. And so people go out and protest. They're demanding a more liberal, a less corrupt Ukraine. But there's also a section of the protesters who are against Yanukovych because he wants to maintain a relationship both with Europe, the West, the United States, and with Russia rather than entering NATO. These are Ukraine's ultra-nationalists, and we get to the point in 2013 where the protests are going on, and Yanukovych is negotiating a deal for Ukraine because the government desperately needs money to continue to pay people who work for the state and things like that, and they're looking to the EU and to Russia to make that agreement. And as he's about to sign the agreement with the West decides that you could only sign an agreement with us, not also with Russia, and so Yanukovych goes and only signs an agreement with Russia. This exacerbates the protests, but Yanukovych helps to de-escalate the situation by agreeing to hold early elections. And so we have that agreement, but that's not good enough for the United States. And our Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs in 2024 was Victoria Nuland, wife of renowned neocon Robert Kagan. And she is recorded on a phone call saying, "Fuck the EU. They are not moving fast enough on a plan to out Yanukovych." She wants Yatsenyuk as the new leader of Ukraine, and then protest movement leaders Klitschko and Tannybrook on the outside of the government. She also said that at that time, Vice President Joe Biden was on board with the plan, and Jeffrey Pyatt was going to help her all put it together and midwife it. And so this is what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. Now, what actually sets up the events that for Yanukovych to leave office is the ultra-nationalists killing protesters and police officers in Kiev with sniper rifles. The great filmmaker Oliver Stone has a documentary called Ukraine on Fire, where they go over the forensics and show how it was buildings occupied by the protest movement where these shots came from, particularly protesters who were ultra-nationalists. But the protesters being killed immediately provokes riots, and Yanukovych flees Ukraine. As prescribed by Nuland, Yatsenyuk assumed power, and Tannybrook remains outside of the government. These are a couple maps that I think are important. This is the 2010 election of Ukraine. Yanukovych is in blue, and then this is a map of Ukraine showing where people speak the Russian language or are ethnically Russian. And so, and then this is a current map of the battle lines in Ukraine. So it lined up pretty well with the other two. So with the situation, the new government taking over, there's a lot of ultra-nationalists in the government, and that prompts the people of the Crimean Peninsula to demand independence, and they hold a referendum vote. This is the outcome. Green is yes, we want to join Russia. No, we don't want to stay with Ukraine. 97% vote yes, 83% election turnout, and the Europeans observed this election, which against their interest to certify that the people of Crimea actually do want to join Russia. So Russia ends up annexing the Crimean Peninsula. There's no battles in Russia seizing this territory. They fire a couple warning shots, and ultimately 50% of the Ukrainian military actually defects and joins Russia rather than leaving and going back with Ukraine. Then we have this very significant event, the burning of the trade union building in Odessa. In response to the coup in Ukraine in 2014, people who were supportive of Yanukovych went and occupied the trade union building in Odessa. Protesters of the ultra-nationalist faction outside threw petrol bombs inside and burned 46 people on the inside. As people tried to flee, including children, they were beaten. And then Kiev responded to the ongoing protests in the country's eastern region called the Donbass, and the lighter blue area in the far east there, by announcing a terror war. And this led to a larger war and the Donbass republics declaring independence. Now, this lighter or darker orangish region there is the full historical Donbass region, and then the highlighted areas are the areas that are actually separatist. That's where those are the battle lines generally for the civil war. So the civil war starts in 2014. A few thousand people initially die in the fighting, and then an agreement is negotiated in 2015 between France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. That's Putin, Merkel, I forget the French president there, and Petro Poroshenko, who is elected and becomes Ukraine president in late 2014. And the four of them signed these Minsk protocols that's supposed to grant the Donbass region additional autonomy. So essentially they're going to be separate from Kiev, but they're not going to be their own country. But neither side really implements this agreement. Fighting continues all along, but it is worth noting that even UN observers say that 80% of the civilian casualties were in the separatist Donbass region and not on the Ukrainian side. A lot of people dying by sniper fire and mortar rounds during this time. All right, so let's talk about the ultranationalist groups. This is a big topic in the media. They say if you bring it up, you're supporting Putin propaganda, and I will get into that and break that down a little bit. But a lot of the ultranationalists that are in the government are members of the Svoboda Party. This guy right here, Oleh Tanibak, is one of the founders of the Svoboda Party. You see him doing a Nazi salute. There he is with Joe Biden. There he is with John McCain, and Chris Murphy is on the right of John McCain. That's him with Victoria Nuland, Yatsenyuk, the guy who took power, and then behind Victoria Nuland there is the boxer Klitschko, and here he is again with John McCain. So as you see, these people are well within the U.S. government, despite their racist ideology. Now, the Azov Battalion during the this is Svoboda Party. It was founded as the Social Nationalist Party during the 1990s. Very clever way of hiding that you're National Socialists, I guess. And their initial stick was very anti-Semitic. Now, in the 2000s, they realized that that wasn't too great a PR, and so they really changed their messaging to being anti-Russia, but they are opposed to essentially all of Ukraine's ethnic minorities. Andrei Parubi is the founder of Patriots of Ukraine, and this is their flag, which is a modified Nazi symbol. Now, they claim that's an N with the I in the middle of it, but it's actually the woven angle that the Nazis used. And this is Andrei Parubi, who actually became the Ukrainian Speaker of the Parliament, sitting down with John McCain. Right Sector is a little bit less extreme than the other groups I have up here, but nonetheless, they are a militia. They are Ukrainian ultranationalists. They have been reported committing crimes against minority groups in Ukraine. But most importantly, this group had a lot of territory that they were controlling in Ukraine's Donbass leading up to the civil war. And they were flying these flags in regions of Ukraine where everybody spoke Russian. People are ethnic Russians. I think this is probably something like putting the Confederate battle flag up in Martin Luther King Jr. Park in the middle of an inner city, right? This is the way people feel about this kind of flag in this country. It's directly against them and saying that, they're not welcome in the country. C14 actually stands for the 14 words of the white supremacist creed, and this is a militant group that it isn't very large, but they do roam the streets of Kiev and keep order. And this is the leader of C14, Yevhen Keshen Karas, and he is giving a statement on the Euromaidan revolution, and he's explaining that, look, you have a protest movement that's 90% liberals. These people care about gay rights, they care about reforms, and he's saying that what you need is 10 to 8% of people to be militant and to be driven, and that will get them to be able to steer the movement. And he says right here, if not for the nationalists, the whole thing would have turned into a gay pride parade. That's, that's his saying that's an issue, that he wanted to be an ultra-nationalist movement. All right, the Azov Battalion is probably the most well-known of the Ukrainian white supremacist groups or neo-Nazi groups. Their symbol is literally two combined neo-Nazi signs. That's the wolf's angle of the neo-Nazi. That's the black sun of the Nazis. They put it together with a wave in front of it, and that is the Azov Battalion. Here they are with a swastika, a NATO flag, and giving Hitler salutes. This is right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I put up this picture to show just how embedded the Azov Battalion was within the Ukrainian military. They actually became a part of the National Guard. When Fox News host Bret Baier asked Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about a month ago about Azov, he said, "They are what they are. They're a part of our military." And so this is them, though they were training just regular Ukrainians like this old lady before the Russian invasion. This is some members of the Azov Battalion being trained on how to use Western weapons. That rocket launcher on the table there is a British-made NLAW that's capable of taking out tanks. And then here is a video that the Ukrainian National Guard posted on their verified account and Twitter left up, and is a video of Azov fighters of the National Guard greasing bullets and pig lards to shoot at what they call Muslim orcs. So these are, again, the type of people that we're talking about here. When we move on to 2015, the civil war is going on, and Barack Obama actually refuses to arm Ukraine in part because of this. Now, he also has an argument saying that Russia maintains escalation dominance. Essentially, any weapons that we give Ukrainians, Russia's just going to add in more weapons, and so we could kill more people, but we really can't change the outcome of a war in Ukraine. And so Barack Obama doesn't want to go to war, but he is training the Ukrainian forces at that time. And so this is an article from the Daily Beast, one of the most anti-Russian outlets that we have today, with the article titled, "How Many Neo-Nazis is the U.S. Backing in Ukraine?" Because the question was how many, not if we are or not. There was a bill in 2016, and it was an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, and what it would have done is prevent any Pentagon funds from going to training the Azov Battalion. And James Cardin writes for The Nation, another very liberal left-wing outlet, saying that under pressure from the Pentagon, Congress has stripped spending the bill of an amendment that prevented funds from falling into the hands of Ukrainian neo-fascist groups. And Cardin also explains that the U.S. is training them. This year, we found out that the U.S. has spent years training Ukrainian paramilitaries, and they were taking a central role not only in the fight in the Donbass, but then would lead the insurgency once Russia invaded. And so this was by Zach Dorfman in Yahoo News, and we don't really know who exactly was trained here, but we do know members of the Ukrainian National Guard, which is largely made up of the Azov Battalion, were trained through this program, were welcomed into the United States. All right, so the Trump administration. I could talk forever about Trump and Russia. I think it's so important, but I am going to try to get through this relatively quickly. I'm not going to go on debunking Russia, so I'll take questions at the end if anybody really has a Russiagate question they want to ask me. But I want to focus on the political impacts of Russiagate in the United States. Trump came into office saying just about everything, right? He was on all sides of all issues. And so, yes, he sounded more dovish than Hillary Clinton sometimes, but sometimes he was also talking about torturing people and blowing up terrorists and their families and dipping bullets in pig blood and all kinds of other really terrible war crimes. And so he gets elected, though, and the Democrats portray him as a dove, too soft on Russia. He's taking his orders from Vladimir Putin, and this essentially creates a political environment in the United States where nobody could be hawkish enough on Russia. You have like some left, like Donald Trump himself, who's saying that we should negotiate with Russia, but if you look at the Republicans, they're the most rabid hawks on the Russia issue, and the Democrats won't give an inch because they think Russia helped to destroy our democracy. And so that set up a political situation that leads to Trump's impeachment, where Donald Trump took a step that Barack Obama didn't and started providing weapons to Ukraine despite the neo-Nazi presence within the government. I didn't understand how the hell that wasn't a scandal. I was sitting there screaming on my podcast saying, I don't understand why all these people who have been calling Trump a Nazi for the past 3 years aren't up in arms about Trump giving weapons to actual Nazis. But I guess that's politics, right? So Trump is refusing to give arms to Ukraine, and then giving arms to Ukraine, and then in 2019 he has a phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and kind of suggests to Zelensky that if he were to launch an investigation into Hunter Biden's position at Burisma, the Ukrainian natural gas company, then he would be able to meet with Trump in Washington, D.C. And then there were some questions about whether Trump would actually hold up military. Now, all the military officials have said that, look, military aid typically takes months and months to get into a country. And so Trump saying this and then instantly going back on it didn't change anything as far as giving weapons to Ukraine. But nonetheless, he was impeached over this. And the call is somewhat inappropriate, although I do think this is within the realm of politics. I mean, don't forget, there was a special prosecutor in Ukraine who was investigating Burisma, this company that Hunter Biden worked for, and Joe Biden bragged about going to Ukraine and leveraging $1 billion in aid to get Ukraine to fire that particular prosecutor. So the House votes to impeach Trump, so the trial goes to the Senate. At the Senate, the Democrats call witnesses, and they make it very clear that this isn't about Trump leveraging the weapons to go to Ukraine. This is about Trump merely at any point in time saying that the weapons weren't going to Ukraine. They stated that it was the interagency policy for these weapons to be shipped to Ukraine, and that we had to fight Russia over there so we didn't have to fight them over here. This lunacy from the Bush administration made its way into the Democratic Party during the impeachment of Donald Trump. Ultimately, he's exonerated in the Senate. And there's one more really important thing that happened in the Trump administration, and this is the Kerch Strait incident. So once Russia annexes the Crimean Peninsula, the Kerch Strait, both sides of the waterway that links the Black Sea to that smaller body of water, the Sea of Azov, is under Russian control, and they enforce new rules for crossing that. Petro Poroshenko at the time is about to lose an election to Zelensky, and he decides that his ships are going to start ignoring the Russian orders. Those ships get fired on by Russia, and he demands that the U.S. get involved. Fortunately, we decided not to, but I do think that's going to have an impact on the Russian battle plans and the invasion that we'll talk about in a minute here. All right, so next up, we got President Joe Biden. He takes office, and he makes Ukraine a de facto NATO ally. I really think this is probably the most important development leading up to the invasion. Now, the good news, as I said, Biden comes into office and Sten's New Start, and then he does the worst thing, and he carries out these war games called Defender Europe 21. And he puts about 37,000 troops into former states that were either a part of the USSR or a part of the Warsaw Pact, and carries out war games simulating various invasions. The Russians absolutely lose their mind, demand the U.S. stop doing this over and over again. They're even carrying out these war games in Ukraine, and it leads Russia to carrying out a pretty large military buildup in March within Russia, but on Ukraine's border. This leads the Biden administration to start making statements like, we will defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We support the sovereignty of Ukraine. We will, give arms to support the sovereignty of Ukraine. And at times, it sounds like the Biden administration is saying we're going to go to war to defend Ukraine from Russia, although they stopped relatively short of saying that. But Ted Galen Carpenter, writing in The American Conservative, explains that all the U.S. obligations that they have made to Ukraine, training their forces, providing the security assistance, they provided a whole bunch of what they call democracy stabilization funds for the Ukrainian government, which is basically money for whoever the U.S. lights in Ukraine to use to help their political campaigns, to buy influence and things like that. And so Ted explains that this essentially made Ukraine a de facto NATO member. And this is crossing the key Russian red line, as I pointed out. And again, this is from the current CIA director, former State Department employee William Burns. He's not somebody who's giving Putin's point of view when he's saying that this is a firm all around Russian red line. Everybody, not just Putin and his hardliners, but even the liberals who oppose Putin in Russia are against this. Ukraine joining NATO. So Biden's stepping all over that key red line. And then in November, Russia starts their military buildup, and the U.S. responds by signing an agreement with Ukraine saying that you will definitely become a NATO member. And then Biden sent Lloyd Austin to Ukraine and Georgia to tell them that they were going to become NATO members. Maybe the last off-ramp to avoid the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the December 17th security proposal that Russia sent to the U.S. and NATO. A lot of the things on this list I think are pretty reasonable. An increase in diplomacy through the Russian NATO Council. NATO responded to this by expelling the Russian diplomats at that council. When it asked NATO to draw down forces in Europe to the 1997 levels, this is asking the U.S. to move NATO forces out of countries that were once a part of the Warsaw Pact or a part of the USSR. We completely declined on that. A return to the INF treaty. This is the only issue in the Russian security proposal that the U.S. really responded to. They offered to have Russia inspect the sites in Poland and Romania to ensure that there would be no nuclear-tipped cruise missiles there, but obviously, that's pretty short of what Russia's asking for. They asked for the end of NATO expansion. The U.S. said the door to NATO will always remain open. They asked for the end of war games on both sides here in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. The U.S. continued to carry out war games in Ukraine in particular. And then in 2020, in January and February, leading up to the Russian invasion, I think one of the most important developments that nobody is talking about is the fact that Zelensky was saying that it was not Vladimir Putin that was causing a crisis in Ukraine, but was Joe Biden, by warning about potential Russian invasion. There's a lot of people in Ukraine, particularly in the north of the country and around Kiev, who said they were completely unprepared for a potential Russian invasion, and a lot of that probably has to do with Zelensky saying that there was no way it was potentially going to happen in the months leading up to the invasion. So on February 24th, Putin announced that special military operations were set to begin, saying that the main objective was supporting the newfound independence that he recognized of the Donbass republics. And so he hit several sites around Ukraine. There's allegations of chemical weapon or biological weapons, nuclear weapons. And in fact, Zelensky did mention in the days before the Russian invasion that Ukraine could revoke its commitment to the Budapest Memorandum, suggesting that his country could try to develop nuclear weapons. So that was fairly significant. Serious fighting broke out in the Donbass before the announcement of the Russian special military operations on February 24th, and most of those strikes were coming from the Ukrainian side going into Russia. Now, the complete timeline on that is unclear, but it does seem that about 80% of the rounds being fired in the lead up to the Russian invasion were actually coming from the Ukrainian government side. And that does suggest that, some of this timing on the Russian side for going into Ukraine could have been about protecting the Donbass. And then initially Russian forces pushed towards Kiev, and it's all up in the air at this point. There's some analysts who are saying that Russia pushed towards Kiev to draw the Ukrainian forces out of the east of the country back to the capital. It's possible. It's also possible that Putin miscalculated here, went for Kiev, and wasn't able to secure it and ended up turning around. Now, what the Americans are doing as a proxy war in Ukraine, they are sending a whole lot of arms. We've sent so far 14,000 Stinger missiles, 5,500 Javelin missiles, 14,000 other anti-armor systems, nearly 1,000 Switchblade drones, 90 155 millimeter howitzers, along with 200,000 rounds, hundreds of armored vehicles, 200 armored personnel carriers, 1,000 small arms, 50 million rounds of ammunition, 21 Mi-17 helicopters, and then also a bunch of other weapons from Afghanistan, where the U.S. recently left about $7 billion worth of weapons behind. So if you think we're sending these weapons to Ukraine, just imagine where they're going to end up, because now the Afghan army doesn't exist and there's $7 billion worth of U.S. weapons in Afghanistan. Neo-Nazis are flocking to Ukraine. I found this from the Washington Post, saying that one of their monitoring groups found the highest level of extremists moving to a battlefield since the war in Syria, going to the Islamic State. These are white nationalists answering the call of the Azov battalion and moving into Ukraine. The weapons are going into a black hole. This was admitted by CNN. A U.S. official speaking with CNN said, "We have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a big black hole, and you have almost no sense of it after a short period of time." And so look at this situation. Billions of dollars of weapons going into Ukraine. Neo-Nazis are going to Ukraine. We have no idea where the weapons we're sending to Ukraine are going. If you look at battlefields in the Middle East, you'll often see that even if there are moderates involved in the fight, the extremists typically take over. They rise to the ranks to the top, in part because moderates don't want to do the extreme things that can be done to win battles, like landmining civilian roads, but extremists will do that. When you also have people entering in from other countries, they're going to care less about the civilians living there, so planting landmines and stuff isn't quite as big of a deal. The U.S. is providing a lot of intelligence assistance to Ukraine. They bragged about providing Ukraine with intelligence that they used to down a Russian troop transport that killed hundreds of Russian soldiers. We are training Ukrainian forces all over the place. There were some in the U.S. that recently just went back to Ukraine. In a big announcement, the Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said that the U.S. was training Ukrainian forces in Germany on the howitzers that we're providing, and in 2 other locations that he cannot disclose. Obviously, for Russia, this is a very big deal. The U.S. is training these troops to go into Ukraine and kill Russian forces, and this is, creating a lot of tensions between the 2 countries. Isolating Russia. This is our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. We are trying to sanction Russia, and we have portrayed the world as isolating Russia completely, although this really isn't the case. I mean, if we look at this map here on countries that voted to remove Russia from the Human Rights Council, it's somewhat similar to the countries that have voted to sanction Russia. We can see that it's really not 100% across the board, and that there are a lot of countries that are not on board with the U.S. effort to isolate Russia. It's really Western countries that are aligned in trying to isolate Russia, which isn't going to be quite so effective. Now, they are also trying to kick Russia out of all kinds of international bodies. And one of the most high school things I have ever heard coming out of international work, U.S. and European officials are walking out of all meetings once Russian officials start speaking. So the World Bank, they're having a meeting on, a famine in Africa. The Russian minister starts speaking, the Americans are leaving. That's the level of diplomacy that we have going on right now. So basically what they're trying to do in Ukraine is do an Afghanistan redux. If in the 1970s and 1980s, the CIA was waging Operation Cyclone in the Afghanistan, helping Osama bin Laden and his buddies kill some Soviets. And boy, didn't that turn out real well, right? No blowback at all from that. And so when the invasion happened, we had Hillary Clinton going on the Rachel Maddow show to say that, look, this way, we did this in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and it didn't end well for the Russians. I don't know. I guess she should have mentioned New York City a little bit there too, because it didn't seem to end well there. So this was the policy, but more, Hillary Clinton now is a retired politician, but Zbigniew Brzezinski is really a U.S. political thought leader on foreign policy, and he laid this out in 2014. If the major cities, say Kharkiv and Kiev, were to resist the street fighting became a necessity, it would be prolonged and costly. And the fact of the matter is, and this is where the timing of this whole crisis is important, Russia is not yet ready to undertake that type of effort. It would be too costly in blood, paralyzing, costly in finances. And so this is about providing the Ukrainians with the kind of arms that we provided to Afghanistan, because we were able to help the Afghans kill 15,000 Russians and bleed the USSR. Now, one thing that they're not mentioning is about 1 million Afghans died in that war. And so that's why I say that the Americans are fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainians. They're not willing to put any of their own blood in Ukraine to take Russia down, but they're definitely willing to let the Ukrainians die to do so. All right, so this last point I want to make here is probably, I think, the most potent thing, is this isn't about the Ukrainians. This is a RAND study. This is a think tank that's funded by a lot of governments, and they put together this study. And the purpose of the study is, they say, recognizing that some level of competition with Russia is inevitable, this report seeks to define areas where the United States can do so to its advantage. We examine a range of nonviolent measures that could exploit Russia's actual vulnerabilities and anxieties as a way of stressing the Russian military and economy. And what they are saying is that one day the Russian economy will be able to compete with the American economy, and so we have to make sure Russia is as weak as possible. As that, not that Russia's ever going to invade America or do anything that threatens us, but the mere fact that Russia is a large country with a powerful military and has a lot of resources, that means that we have to do something to take Russia down. And these are the steps that that RAND laid out, and you can see essentially all of them have been so far have gone in motion. There was a recent coup attempt in Belarus in 2021, also in Kazakhstan, in Central Europe, and then Central Asia, and then recently there's been a series of explosions in Moldova's breakaway region Transnistria, and that's suggesting that it could be spreading there next. This is from the Washington Post, saying that for some in NATO, they prefer Ukrainians to continue fighting and dying over a peace that comes too early. This is the Washington Post saying that that's the policy of NATO members. Here's Turkey saying that this is the policy of NATO members. The Turkish foreign minister said that there are countries within NATO who want the war to continue. They want Russia to become weaker. And here it is from our Secretary of Defense. He went to Ukraine, and then at a press conference in Poland, he said that the policy in Ukraine is to defend Ukraine, and then went on to say that the policy is to weaken Russia. And so that is, I think the biggest part of the case that that the U.S. is really trying to wage a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. The U.S. is also making no effort to end this diplomatically. Obviously, we had the Russian security proposal. We know steps that could have been taken prior to the invasion to prevent it, but we also have steps that could be taken now, like closing the door on NATO expansion, which again, the U.S. is continuing to refuse to do, and even looking to expand NATO. Since the invasion has started, one of the few countries that has a very unique relationship with both Russia and Ukraine is Turkey. They've sold weapons to Ukraine. They've bought weapons from Russia. So what better way in the world to be in a position to negotiate diplomacy? But the U.S. has been trying to undermine that by offering Turkey free weapons if they transfer their Russian-made weapons to Ukraine to kill Russians with, because they just think that would be hilarious. And then with Israel, Secretary of State Antony Blinken went last month to the Negev summit, where along with trying to organize the entire world against the Palestinians, he was also pushing Israel to pick a side in the conflict. Israel is a country that has a lot of immigrants from both Russia and Ukraine, and so there's a lot of people there that don't want to see this war go on just because one way or another, they might have a relative that's at risk. But rather, the U.S. has pushed Israel to pick a side. Now, Israel ended up made a statement that was critical of Russia and then offered Ukraine more aid. And Russia completely blew up the relationship by suggesting that the Israelis were arming neo-Nazis, which, there's a little bit of truth to that, but obviously that was very upsetting to the Israel government and really, really undermined any diplomacy between the two countries. Now, Russia is really destroying Ukraine, and this is important. I don't want to excuse the Russian warfare here at all. About 3,100 people have died, civilians have died according to the UN so far. I don't know how accurate that UN estimate is. I'm assuming it's the low number, that those are the number of people that have died. There's other bodies bodies buried under the rubble. Maybe we'll find them, maybe we won't. It's not exactly clear that Russia is responsible for every single civilian that's being killed. They are carrying out bombing, they are carrying out artillery strikes, but so are the Ukrainians. And, you know, depending on what area of Ukraine you're in, one side or the other may be more willing to be a little bit more indiscriminate with their shelling, particularly if you have the Azov battalion, say, fighting around Mariupol or something like that, where a lot of the alleged war crimes are said to have happened. Just today, I read from the Associated Press that they believe 600 civilians were killed when some kind of explosion caused the Mariupol theater to collapse. And so, you know, still looking on more information on a lot of this. There's a lot developing when it comes to the civilian casualties and stuff, but it has been fairly horrific, especially in areas that Russia is really trying to take, like Mariupol and eastern Ukraine. There's been some fighting around Odessa, but this city I think is very important because it's on Ukraine's Black Sea coast, and I do think the ultimate goal of Russia will be to deprive Ukraine of all of its coastline. So I want to take a minute to talk about the great Ukrainian democracy, and the first with this movie by starring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Love in the Big City 2, a very exciting rom-com, banned in Ukraine because it's in the Russian language. So there's a couple interesting things there. First of all, before Zelensky became president of Ukraine, he didn't really speak Ukrainian. All of his movies and TV show, Servant of the People, are in Russian. In fact, you could find a lot of people in Ukraine complaining about the show Servant of the People because only backwards hillbillies speak Ukrainian and all the serious politicians speak Russian. So, but anyways, a member of the Sloboda Party ended up as head of the Ukrainian Cultural Ministry, and that person gets to assign ratings to movies. And so if he deprives a rating to a movie, that means you can't see that movie in Ukraine, and that's what happened to the current president's flick there. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky nationalized the country's media after the Russian election and also banned 11 political parties, including the largest Ukrainian opposition party. And then just yesterday, I saw the Associated Press reported that they were following around a team of Ukrainian soldiers, rounding up people at gunpoint for making posts on social media that were too pro-Russian. All right, so this is the last thing I have, I think, which is just going over, I think, some stories that are pretty important that have led to disinformation being spread and things that I also think are narrative control, trying to set the allowable discourse in the United States. So I want to talk about Snake Island and Ghost of Kiev kind of on their own real quick, because this is something that I wasn't surprised about, right? The Ukrainian government is looking to rally its people. And so having some heroic fighter pilot who shot down 10 Russian planes sounds really cool. And, you know, that's going to trend on social media and it's going to get some people down to the recruitment centers and things like that. But, you know, understanding how modern warfare works, a Ukrainian in an outdated plane is not going to shoot down 10 advanced Russian jets and not get shot down itself. Most of the Ukrainian runways were destroyed at that point. Most of the Ukrainian Air Force was destroyed at that point. There was no way this was happening. But if you turned on Fox News or CNN, the host would tell you the Ghost of Kiev is keeping Russia from dominating the Ukrainian skies. This beautiful warplane that America has helped to maintain is helping to save the lives of Ukrainians. Completely false. Snake Island, again, completely false. Well, not completely false. There were people on Snake Island. They did tell the Russians to go away, but rather than getting blown up, they all surrendered. So it's not quite as heroic of a story as the Ukrainian government would like to pretend, but at the same time, you can understand the Ukrainian government spreading those stories. What's unacceptable is our American media spreading these stories. They should be telling the truth to us. They're not trying to propagandize us, but yet they told us stories that were clearly Ukrainian government propaganda. So that's really problematic. The Disinformation Board, I'm sure most of us know about this. Nina Jankowicz, Miss Mary Poppins, seems a lot, is now ahead of determining what is and what isn't relevant information in the United States. More seriously, she has previously worked for the Ukrainian government, so that seems to be a major conflict of interest here. But also, she's just been flat out wrong on things. She said the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, which is completely 100% not true. Every news source has now verified that those were authentic emails. Russia has waged this war saying that they are carrying out denazification in Ukraine. This is bullshit. So this is something that a lot of people, even in the anti-war community or the libertarian community, will repeat. This is the same as saying that George Bush was really waging a war on terrorism. Yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine. Yes, Russia would like to kill some of the Nazis in Ukraine. No, this war is not about the Nazis in Ukraine. There are claims of genocide on both sides, both bunk. If you look at the number of people being killed in this war, it just doesn't raise anywhere near genocide levels. Both sides are allowing civilians to leave on humanitarian corridors. These things are always complicated in war times. They always get shut down. But at the same time, the corridors do open from time to time. People are not trying to just wipe out the civilian population. They're trying to conquer territory. And then I want to talk about condemning Russia here because, look, I'm an anti-war activist. I oppose all war. I mainly oppose American wars, though, because those are the wars that my tax dollars go to. Those are the wars that my elected politicians go towards. And, it really got me thinking something. Has anybody in this room ever been asked to condemn an American war? Has anybody ever went up to you and said, condemn the Iraq war, or you're a bad person? Condemn the war in Yemen, or you're a bad person? All right, there's one for Vietnam. I wasn't alive then, so I can't go back that far. But I've never once been asked, and I weigh in on foreign policy conversations all the time. Never a question, even though my tax dollars go to these wars. The elected people of the places I live, they vote for these wars. Why am I not demanded to condemn American wars? But if I want to have any opinion at all on the war Russia is waging in Ukraine, I have to automatically condemn it. It's about narrative control. It's about anybody who has to condemn Russia, then it implies that you have some kind of sympathies for Russia. And of course, it just sets the standard that this is particularly bad or evil when this is a war. Wars are bad. Wars are evil, right? But the U.S. killed far more people in Iraq by now. We were carpet bombing entire cities. 15,000 people died in the first 3 weeks of that war. If you look at wars like Yemen, where there's 400,000 people that have died in the past 7 years, but over 200,000 of them are children. Again, nobody ever is asked or pressured at all to condemn any of those interventions, and yet this Russian one is the one we had to universally ban. Now, after the invasion happened, there were 3 major bans on PayPal: Consortium News, Minpress News, and Alan McLeod, who are all very important anti-war voices. Their accounts were frozen, so tens of thousands of dollars PayPal stole from these people. And the good news is, actually, just before I came here today, I was talking to some people, and PayPal is going to release the funds for sure, and then they're going to talk to them about being re-allowed on the platform, or at least long enough to switch off the recurring donors and things like that. So some pressure worked, and I could end on some good news there.
I'm interested in how you do your research. How do you verify that a source is accurate? For example, you, and I would agree with you, say you can't really trust the mainstream media narrative, but at the same time, you're quoting articles, for example, from AP. So I'm wondering, do you look at one particular source? How do you vet the things that you're quoting in your presentation?
Yeah, I mean, so it's challenging, especially anytime you're talking about war zone. I try to, wait and not jump on things right away, right? Even if it's breaking news from whatever outlet, I'm not immediately trying to say oh, this is the facts or not. There's a matter of just, I've paid attention to wars in the Middle East, so kind of see how wars operate, kind of know what to expect, but also looking at statements from different governments, seeing who's admitting to things against interest. Say, Russia says that 13,000 or 1,300 of their troops have been killed. I assume that means that 1,300 Russian troops have been killed at least, right? And so trying to take information that way. If CNN, who has been relentlessly pushing that we need to add more weapons to Ukraine, is now saying from a U.S. government official, we don't know where those weapons are going. That seems like some reporting against interest that I'm a little bit more interested in. On the AP, when it comes to like the collapse at the Mariupol theater, I'm unsure. They're saying 600. I think the Ukrainian government only said 300 for that event, and so it's kind of odd that the Ukrainian government isn't inflating that number as much as possible. So I'm very skeptical on seeing them round up dissidents. They actually had video footage of it, and so you could believe a little bit of what you see with your eyes. Looking for multiple sources to confirm something is also important, or waiting for governments to deny something, or an absence of denial could also be important. And so if the Pentagon isn't saying we know where the weapons are going, we feel like we have some fidelity in the country, that's some indication that they don't.
Awesome presentation, Kyle. It was so cool, so good. But my question has to do with escalation. Knowing that a big portion of the U.S. government's goal is regime change in Moscow, do you see a lot of opportunity for escalation coming from the West, basically, to use this whole Ukraine situation to further destabilize Russia and eventually, do something to send some of these terrorist fighters or whoever into Russia proper? And what would Russian response be? I mean, that's a big concern. Escalation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess on the fighters, my guess is that they really just don't care. They see them like as an immediate benefit to be able to weaponize them against Russia, but in the long term, they're really, they're not like thinking like, oh, one day this is going to blow back into Russia or something like that, would be my guess. I don't really see any opportunity for de-escalation between the West and Russia because of the lines that Russia is setting, or the West is setting. The UK is saying that they're not going to remove any sanctions from Russia until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. Well, that includes the Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula, which, quite frankly, is never going to be Ukrainian again. Russia has invested billions of dollars into the the Crimean infrastructure since taking over. The people there overwhelmingly are happy and want to remain a part of Russia, and so it's just not going to change. But if the UK is saying that that's a standard for removing sanctions, then the sanctions are never going to be removed. And we even have had Western officials mention that there may be deals that Zelensky and Ukraine are willing to accept that the West isn't. And so this could really drag on the whole war, not just the Western Russian tensions, because I do see a potential where in the coming months, in part because of attrition, in part just because the land borders get set up, that the fighting actually dies down a little bit in Ukraine itself, and maybe even a negotiated settlement between Kiev and Moscow is possible that doesn't actually change the status of the tensions between the West and Russia.
Hey, John Kittleson again, U.S. House District 1. If you live in Denver, vote for me. If you had to pick one thing of all the things you've researched and all the information you've come across, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding that you wish you could clarify or you wish was more widely known?
The Russian red line on NATO expansion to Ukraine. There was a Biden administration official who said after the Russian invasion that the U.S. never made Russia an offer on closing NATO expansion because they didn't think it was a serious issue for Russia. And it clearly is. I don't know how the CIA director wasn't in the room when those discussions were going on, because he, at least at the time, knew. Now, there's always the potential that William Burns is just a government sycophant, and whoever his boss is, he's just going to say whatever that person wants to hear. But I thought it's at least notable that this guy wrote a memo to his boss at the time, Condoleezza Rice, saying that this was the brightest of Russian red lines, and then now the Biden administration wouldn't even talk or concede that to Russia leading up to the invasion, a move that could have potentially stopped it.
Hello. About 7 p.m., before I even entered the room for this meeting, I've read online that there's reports that Vladimir Putin is planning on having cancer surgery and that he will temporarily hand over power to someone who is even more hardline than he is. Do you think we can believe these reports?
I would be extremely skeptical. People have speculated on Putin being sick for about 10 years. Now, there was some really strange fuel added to that fire when there were several photo ops of Putin in the past like 4 or 5 months where he's sitting at tables like 20 feet away from people. It's a real mystery as to why he's been very rigid about what world leaders he's meeting with. He forced Marcon to take like 2 COVID tests or something like that. So, I mean, there's a little bit of sprinkles of maybe there's something going on, but with all the rumors that I've heard over the past 10 years, I would be extremely skeptical of that. And, you know, anything's possible, right? He could have found out he had cancer last week, but it seems kind of unlikely that Putin, who is somebody who wants a firm hand on power because the last time he relinquished power in 2012, he feels like the Biden or the Obama administration conned his replacement, Dmitry Medvedev. And I guess I don't think he would plan to carry out an invasion and then have cancer surgery the next week. Again, anything's possible. It just there's a lot of things that made me very skeptical of that.
So a couple people that I follow in alternative media, obviously there's a lot of things going on with this conflict, whatever people may think of it. But they're saying that one element of it is that as the COVID narrative collapses, which is, damaged supply chains, destroyed businesses, racked up debt, money printing by central banks, that in part there's the element of this being kind of a cover story. Because one of the people I was listening to said Putin had any time to invade Ukraine, could have at least attempted to in the last 8 or so years. And now he's just doing his role as part of the what many would refer to as the Great Reset. I've been hearing things about, getting the this being a way of getting, first of all, being a smokescreen, kind of a cover story, and also getting the U.S. more with them sanctioning Russia against the access to the world reserve currency and so forth, more of a means of just weakening the global economy for more solutions that they offer to the problems that they created. What do you think in regards to that?
I don't believe the government is that competent or that capable of putting together a conspiracy quite that in depth. But I do think a part of what you're saying is right. And so there have been great supply chain disruptions over the past couple of years. There's regions of the world that have been plagued by conflict, largely led or encouraged by the United States, where there are severe shortages coming. Africa is going to be in a desperate situation coming up soon, especially the Horn of Africa. They're saying, I think, 1 million people in Somalia, 2 or 3 million in Ethiopia, who are not going to have access to food. Right across the Red Sea from the Horn of Africa is, of course, Yemen, where there's millions and millions of people short on food from the 7-year-long U.S. war. And now you have the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, going around saying that, well, there's only reason there's food shortages is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now, look, Russia and Ukraine are both major suppliers of staple foods and fertilizer. And so the war in Ukraine combined with the U.S. sanctions effort against Ukraine is going to deliver a major impact to the world food market. But the reason people are starving in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Yemen today has absolutely zero to do with this war. I don't know any crop that grows in 2 months. So how the hell could the invasion have stopped that? They're planting crops right now, not harvesting them. Now, the shipping is a little bit bigger of an issue because ships go in and out of the Black Sea. And of course, that's a war zone right now. I've heard that several sea mines have washed up pretty close to Turkey. And so these are a real concern for civilian ships, particularly anything that's carrying oil, because if it hits a mine, it's going to explode in the Black Sea and it's going to be a disaster. Yeah. But I don't think it's intentional with the sanctions. I think the West just has done this. This is the playbook. Anytime there's a country you don't like, but you really don't have the ability to go to war yet, you put sanctions on that country until you do. And that's what the U.S. is doing here with Russia, just like they do with North Korea, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba.
Right. And one other thing, all right, if I could ask like a second part of the question is, what do you see the economic impact of this being towards the dollar over the next 12 to 18 months or so?
I mean, I'm not an economist in any way, so I struggle to comment on these things just because I don't keep up with what the Fed is doing, with what the World Bank is doing, what the U.S. GDP to deficit ratio is at any time. A lot of it's going to depend on who gets elected in the 2022 midterms, on how much money the U.S. government is spending. So there's a lot I can't weigh in on that. But overall, it's going to hurt, right? They had pipelines shipping gas from Russia into Central Europe, making energy costs very cheap. Well, Russia could now export that gas to plenty of different countries, but it's all going to go by ship, which is a lot slower, more expensive. And the U.S. could make up for, with other countries, can make up for the energy supplies needed to go to Europe, but it's going to come at a much higher price because loading up those liquefied natural gas ships and sending them across the Atlantic Ocean is far more expensive than the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so, I mean, from my libertarian perspective, it's absolutely devastating. We're ruining supply chains and making things on the global stage as ineffective as possible in the name of hurting Putin. But if you look at how the Russian economy has responded to this, it's rebounded. In part is because since 2014, in the U.S. response to the Russian annexation of Crimea, Russia has basically said eventually the West is going to cut off our economy, and for the past 8 years has been preparing to be sanctioned by the West. This has hurt the Russian economy during that time. It's artificially suppressed it. Central planning, I don't like it. But now that the U.S. has applied the sanctions, Russia has been able to recover some.
Why? So there are a million countries in the world that the U.S. or NATO could target with their aggression. Why does it have to be the country that is most likely to lead to nuclear war? Some people say like standard military industrial complex, graft, weapons contract stuff, but again, there's so many countries. Why Russia?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to the RAND study, where China and Russia are the two countries that could one day maybe compete with the United States. And because of that, the U.S. feels it has to take on those countries and artificially suppress them. And that's why Russia at this point. Not him.
Just a quick question. What do you wash your hair with? Thank you.
Just a mix of things.
Hey, John Kittleson again, U.S. Congressional District 1. Don't forget. Hey, I'm going to ask a hard question, and it's okay if you don't answer, because it is, a loaded or hard question. I know you have your podcast and everything. From Putin's point of view, do you think his invasion, or not even just Putin's point of view, because of course his invasion is justified, but from like the Russians country's standpoint, do you think the invasion is justified because they were trying to sell it as denazification and this is a kind of a peacekeeping mission? So where they stand right now and just the current state of things inside of Russia, do you think the invasion is justified? And of course I'm speaking from the other side, and I know it's kind of a hard question, so if you want to pass, that's okay.
No, so polling from Russia says 80% of Russians support it, but Putin is also rounding up anti-war activists. So, how many people are lying to make sure that, the KGB or, the new Russian security services don't come for them in the middle of the night because they're opposing the wars? I don't know. My sense is that if they're polling at 80%, there's probably not 30% of people lying, so it probably is a majority of Russians. Putin has been a fairly popular president this whole time. As I talked about, Yeltsin was a depressed drunk who was constantly sick in the pocket of the Americans and allowed his country to have billions of dollars of their wealth stolen. And Putin came up and to some extent put an end to that. Now, he put his own corrupt cronies in charge and things like that, but at the same time, it wasn't the old playbook anymore. So he has remained a fairly popular president in Russia. And because of those two factors, I would guess that a slight majority of Russians do feel that the invasion is justified. There's a lot of propaganda on Russian TV. I don't know how well it works. I suppose that Russians are probably a lot like Americans, and whatever you put on CNN, a lot of them will adopt that position and just kind of repeat it. And so if Russian TV is saying that war is good, then there might be a lot of people going for it for that reason. And there's now been a series of explosions that have been carried out inside of Russia as well, which I'm guessing is going to galvanize the Russian people in favor of the invasion. But it could always have the opposite effect, or anything could change in Russia. But I would guess it's fairly popular in Russia, over 50%.
Thank you. My question is regarding NATO expansion. One of your earlier slides said that Secretary Baker had promised that with the reunification of Germany, NATO would not expand. I was looking that up and I couldn't find any confirmation for that. That is, there's nothing in writing like the Budapest Memorandum, for example. And if it was so important to Russia, why didn't they demand it in writing? And maybe it is, and if so, you could expand on that. But I also want to add that the counter-argument about Russia's fear of NATO expansion is that NATO never really represented any kind of imperialist threat to anybody. You could say Libya and maybe when Clinton went into Serbia and Bosnia, but it's not like Russia going into Georgia or Chechnya, for example. Plus, more that NATO for 70 years had the bomb in, prior to 1949 when Russia had it, and when Germany and the Berlin crisis was going on. The U.S. could have said, "We have the bomb, get the hell out." We didn't. I'm trying to make a case that NATO doesn't represent the real threat. Plus, we can never get NATO, to even fund their own military. So how are they going to be expansionists in terms of conquering other countries if they're not even willing, to spend enough money to defend themselves? And then I think it wasn't until 1994 that the Baltic states and Poland, wanted to join NATO because they saw Russia as being a threat to them. Okay, I think you get the point. Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess on the World War II argument, I would just add that immediately after World War II was several years before the Russian-U.S. relationship fell apart. I mean, the U.S. helped Russia defeat the Nazis in World War II. So that's, I think, a part of the reason that the relationship was initially like it was. On NATO, I mean, it's fought 4 aggressive wars and no defensive wars. So that would tell me it's more of an aggressive warfare alliance than a defensive one. There's tons of inter-NATO problems anyways. The U.S. has constant trouble reining Turkey in on a whole host of issues. And so I don't see how it could really be considered a defensive alliance in any way when it's expanded all the way up to Russia's borders and now includes former members of the Soviet Union. And again, crossing Russian red lines the whole time and waging aggressive wars in 4 different countries. I don't see how Russia would assume that that's anything but an offensive threat.
Okay, my question is, why is it that you use the word "we" when talking about U.S. government action?
Like I said, in the condemning Russia one, I do take it personally on myself that we are waging these wars, and keeps me motivated to end them.
I'm going to start charging you $1 per "we."
Any last questions? Artem?
I'm sorry, you said that NATO expands to Russian borders. So do you think that people of that countries are slaves to Putin? Do you think they cannot have their own opinion? Do you think they were forced to be NATO members? Or they decided by themselves?
I think they were. The U.S. courses countries and has propped up different countries. It carried out a coup in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. It's done so in several other states to make sure that the governments in charge of these countries are pro-NATO. The U.S. offers a lot of incentives financially for NATO members. For the Baltic states, it's offering security. It's offering the full strength and power of the American military to a state that spends a few $billions a year on its military. It's a great deal for these countries. Of course they want in, but that doesn't mean that America should have to defend them. And also, I really reject the whole idea that just because I don't want NATO expansion, I want somehow Putin to enslave the people of the Baltics. That's just absurd. The guy could barely take half of Ukraine, and you're saying he's going to enslave the people of the Baltics? Come on.
Last question. Tremendous presentation. You covered almost everything. The only thing that you covered that I was curious about was the biolabs, which I believe started as an internet conspiracy, and then Victoria Nuland basically admitted this was a real thing to Congress. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on the biolabs?
Okay, so the history of the official history of these biolabs made by the U.S. government is there's 26 of them in Ukraine, and what they were doing was storing and working on leftover things from the Soviet Union. The part about the leftover from the Soviet Union made sense. The part about them needing to work on it for 30 years and not being able to move, transfer it, or destroy it in that time seems kind of odd to me. So I kind of suspect that there may have been something more going on there. But at the same time, these kind of weapons programs are intentionally hard to define. They'll say, well, this is a defensive bioweapons programs. Well, what's the difference between a defensive and offensive bioweapon? Well, for the defensive one, they design an offensive bioweapon, and then they figure out how to defend against it. And so you do end up with offensive weapons anytime you're really, making defensive ones anyways. But we don't know what was happening at those labs, and I do find it kind of interesting that Russia hasn't pushed the issue after they secured the site of at least a few of them. I really thought that they would push the issue if there was something there. So maybe there's not. Same thing happened with the nuclear issues. Putin suggested that Ukraine could potentially be looking to make a dirty bomb or make nukes. And it looks like that's almost 100% false. They've maintained 2 nuclear sites in Ukraine and have turned up 0 evidence.
That's our talk. Give it up for Kyle Anzalone.